Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Every night, as darkness settled, something strange would happen. I never knew what to make of it at first. I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but as the days passed, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It always started the same way. I would lie in bed, my eyes heavy from the day's exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. The room felt too still, the air too thick. My eyes would flicker around, drawn to the corners where the light from the street lamp outside barely touched the walls. That's why I saw them, shadows, stretching across the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just the light playing with the objects in my room, creating shapes that weren't there. But each night, the shadows seemed a little different, a little too defined, and I could have sworn they moved. I tried not to focus on them, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But one night, it was impossible to ignore. It began with a soft rustling sound, barely audible over the steady hum of the old fan in the corner. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, or perhaps the house settling. But the sound was deliberate. Like something was shifting, something trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the ceiling, and that's when I saw it. The shadow in the corner of the room, the one I had dismissed so many times before, was different tonight. It had changed shape. It was more distinct, more defined. It looked almost like a hand reaching out. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked rapidly, unsure of what I was seeing. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadow didn't move right away. It lingered there, hanging over me like a dark cloud waiting to descend. And then, without warning, it began to crawl along the ceiling, slowly but deliberately, inching closer and closer to my bed. I held my breath, my body stiffening, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't explain. Was it just the shadow of something in the room? Or was it something else? Something that shouldn't be there? I tried to sit up, to make the figure disappear, but my muscles refused to obey. All I could do was watch as the shadow inched closer, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. I could feel my pulse quicken, hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. There was no escaping it. Whatever it was coming for me. The room seemed to shrink as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, unable to tear my eyes away from the creeping shadow. Every inch it moved felt like a mile, every second a lifetime. The rustling sound continued, now faint but unmistakable, like the scratch of fingertips against the fabric of my mind. It was coming closer. I could feel it. The air grew colder, and I shivered despite the blanket pulled tightly around me. My breath was shallow, ragged, as I tried to find the courage to move, to do something, anything. But the fear held me down, anchored to the bed. The shadow reached the center of the ceiling, directly above me. It paused there for a moment, as though it was studying me, waiting for something. The hand-like shape grew clearer, the fingers elongated, twisting, stretching in unnatural ways. And then, to my horror, the shadow shifted again. This time, it wasn't just a hand. The shape grew larger, darker, taking on a more sinister form. It was a figure now. The outline of a person. No, not a person, something else. Something that wasn't supposed to exist in the real world. I could see its features, if you could call them that. Its face was a blur, as though it was trying to hide itself, but its eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. Hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. A chill ran through me, freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the silence of the room. My mind screamed for me to run, to do something to stop it, but I couldn't. The figure began to lower itself, slowly, inch by inch. It was coming down from the ceiling now, descending like a slow-moving spider, each movement deliberate, careful. I could hear the faintest of sounds, like a breath, or maybe a whisper, but it was impossible to tell where it came from. The air thickened with tension. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like the whole room was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. My heart pounded louder, faster, and yet the figure continued its descent, its shadow stretching longer as it moved closer to the bed. I could feel it now. Its presence was suffocating. I knew it was right there, just above me. I could feel its gaze on me, as though it was waiting for something. And then, it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more of a sensation, a pressure on my mind. A whisper that didn't come from anywhere, but filled the entire room. The words weren't clear, but they echoed in my head like a command. Stay still. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I was trapped in the moment, caught between fear and a strange compulsion to obey. I tried to close my eyes, to block it out, but the shadow was still there. It was always there. I felt its presence, its oppressive weight, bearing down on me. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive, and it was watching me. The pressure in the room intensified, the air thickening with something cold and unnatural. My body felt heavy, as though it was being pressed into the mattress, pinned by invisible forces. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound escaped my throat. The whispering grew louder now, filling the room with an almost physical presence. Stay still. The voice, or whatever it was, seemed to vibrate inside my skull. It was deep, almost guttural, yet oddly familiar. It was like a part of my own thoughts, twisting them, bending them to its will. And though it commanded me to remain frozen, a part of me wanted to fight, to resist. But I couldn't. The figure was so close now. Its shadow stretched across the bed, swallowing the dim light from the street lamp outside, turning the room into a cavern of darkness. I could feel the weight of it, suffocating me, invading my very thoughts. Its presence was unbearable. The hand, which had been hovering just above me, slowly reached down, fingers curling as if to touch me. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, though it hadn't made contact yet. My skin prickled with an icy dread, and a strange, hollow sensation crawled up my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. In the back of my mind, I heard the faintest sound, a rustling, soft like the flutter of wings. It was coming from the darkness, but I couldn't pinpoint where. It felt as though it was circling, waiting for something. For me. The shadow's hand finally brushed against my forehead, its touch ice cold. The moment it made contact, an electric shock shot through my body. The sensation was sharp, like 1,000 needles pricking my skin. I gasped, but no sound came out. My body tensed against the overwhelming force, but it was as though I was trapped in my own skin, unable to escape. I could feel its gaze now, burning into me. It was watching me, waiting for something. The figure's shape seemed to warp, twisting in the darkness, the outline becoming more defined, more terrifying. Its head, once a blurred mass, was now clear, a face. A face that shouldn't exist. Hollow eyes. A wide, stretched grin that was too wide to be human. Its features were grotesque, twisted, as though they had been pulled out of some dark, forgotten nightmare. "You cannot escape," it whispered again, its voice slithering into my thoughts, a cold, smooth hiss that made my skin crawl. The hand pressed harder against my forehead, and I could feel something seeping into my mind, like dark tendrils, spreading across my thoughts. Memories, my own memories, flashed before my eyes, but they weren't mine anymore. They were twisted, distorted. The faces of people I loved blurred and faded, replaced by shadowy figures, staring at me with the same hollow eyes. "You belong to me," the voice murmured, and I felt my thoughts slipping, unraveling. The room was no longer my room. The bed, the walls, the ceiling, all of it had faded into the background, and there was only the figure. Only the eyes. Only the shadow that surrounded me, suffocating me, consuming me. I was losing myself. I could feel it, the pull of the darkness drawing me in. My body was no longer my own. The coldness, the darkness, was everywhere. It was inside me now. The figure leaned closer, its breath warm against my face. Its grin widened, showing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "You're mine now." And then, just as I thought I would lose myself entirely, I felt a shift, something within me, something that wasn't controlled by the shadow. A spark of defiance, a flicker of willpower. I couldn't let it take me. Not without a fight. With every ounce of strength I could summon, I focused on that spark. I fought against the cold grip on my mind, against the suffocating darkness. And as if in response, the figure hissed, its form beginning to distort again, flickering like a broken light. "No!" The voice screamed, a shrill, high-pitched wail that tore through the air. The shadow recoiled, shrinking back, retreating toward the corner of the room. I wasn't sure if it was retreating because it feared me or if it was simply toying with me. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't going to let it win. I gasped for air, my body trembling, my skin still cold from the touch of the shadow. I slowly, cautiously, forced myself to sit up. The figure was gone, but the room still felt wrong. The air was thick with something dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of it. I glanced around, half expecting the shadow to appear again. But all that greeted me was silence. The rustling had stopped. The air had returned to its usual stillness. But I knew better now. It was watching me. It was waiting. And I had no idea what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. The night passed in an eerie silence, and when the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I dared to believe I had imagined the whole thing. My mind, exhausted and frazzled from the terror of the night before, longed for normalcy. Maybe it was just a nightmare, a trick of the light, my overactive imagination playing cruel games with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something more, something that was now always with me. I forced myself to get up, shaking off the remnants of fear still clinging to my skin. I moved through the motions of the morning, dressing, eating, trying to push away the creeping sensation that something was wrong. The room felt heavy now, the familiar walls of my bedroom suddenly foreign, unsettling. I glanced at the ceiling again, but the shadows were gone. Nothing but the quiet light filtering in from outside. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My every movement, every breath, felt scrutinized. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the sensation grew. Like an itch in the back of my mind I couldn't reach, a presence just beyond my awareness, lurking, waiting. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself. I left the house, took a walk outside, anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to me. But even the open air couldn't relieve the tension in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every sound of a car passing by, made my heart race. The streets, once so comforting, now felt like a maze I couldn't escape from. I hurried back to the house, the anxiety gnawing at me, refusing to let go. When I returned home, I immediately felt it again, the weight of the air, the oppressive stillness of the room. But this time, something was different. I walked through the house, checking every corner, trying to reassure myself that nothing had changed. But as I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. I stopped dead in my tracks. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, perhaps. But then I saw it again. The figure, standing just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror. Nothing. But the feeling, it was there again, more intense this time. The air around me felt colder, heavier, as though it had thickened with something I couldn't see. Stay still, I heard the voice again, not spoken aloud, but inside my head. It was softer this time, more insistent, like a warning. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure, was it really gone? Was it behind me, watching? Or was it still lingering in the mirror, just waiting for me to look away? I didn't dare move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, not knowing if I should run or stay. The seconds dragged by, stretching into what seemed like hours. The silence was deafening, the only sound my own shallow breathing. And then, I heard it again. The rustling, faint but unmistakable. Not from behind me, but from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the house. The sound of something moving, something deliberate, creeping closer. I turned my head toward the hallway, my pulse quickening. I didn't want to go investigate. I didn't want to find out what it was. But I couldn't stay frozen here forever. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped forward. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet, but the sound of that rustling was growing louder, closer, as though whatever was making it was moving toward me. I reached the hallway and hesitated. The air felt colder now. Every sound seemed amplified, like I was in a tunnel, and whatever was lurking was just at the edge of my vision. I took a deep breath and turned the corner. There was nothing there. No one. Just the dim hallway, the quiet hum of the house settling. But the feeling didn't fade. It was still there, hanging in the air like a shadow, waiting. I felt eyes on me again, and I couldn't escape the sense of being followed. As if the darkness itself had taken on a shape, a presence that wouldn't let go. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving swiftly across the far wall. It was small at first, just a flicker, but then it grew, stretching and crawling as it followed my every movement. I spun around, my heart racing. But the shadow was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath coming in short gasps, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. Was I losing my mind? Or was this something else? Something far worse than I could understand? Before I could decide, the whisper returned, this time clearer, louder. You cannot hide from me. And with that, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The darkness had found me, and it wasn't going to let me go. The whisper echoed in my mind, reverberating through the hollow emptiness of the house. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stood frozen in the hallway. The air around me was thick, suffocating, as though it was alive, pressing down on me with an unseen weight. The voice was closer now, its tone colder, more insistent. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. You cannot hide from me. I spun around, desperately searching for the source of the voice, but the hallway was empty, just like every other time. The walls were silent, the house still. But I could feel it, the presence was closing in, surrounding me, consuming me. The shadow was there, even if I couldn't see it. I could feel it, like a hand brushing against the back of my neck, trailing down my spine. The air felt colder with every passing second, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. I needed to get out. I needed to run, to escape, but my legs refused to move. My body was paralyzed, caught in the grip of an invisible force. The whispering came again, louder this time, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. Come to me. I couldn't resist. It wasn't like I had a choice. My body moved on its own, drawn forward by an invisible pull, my feet dragging across the carpet. I knew I should fight it, that I had to run, but something inside me, some deep, primal part, urged me to obey. I stumbled toward the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The house felt like a labyrinth, the walls closing in tighter with each movement. As I climbed, the air grew heavier, the darkness more suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and panicked, and the soft rustling that was always just out of reach. I reached the top of the stairs, my mind racing. The whisper was louder now, pressing against my skull, urging me onward. It was coming from my room, the one place where it had all started. I didn't want to go in there. I didn't want to face it, to face them. But my body moved of its own accord, my hand reaching for the doorknob before I even realized what I was doing. The door creaked open. I stepped inside. The room was dark, the shadows deeper now, more oppressive. The familiar walls seemed to loom over me like towering giants, and the air felt wrong. Cold, damp, and filled with the weight of something ancient, something not meant to be here. I didn't want to turn around, but I had no choice. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head. The shadow was there. It had taken form now, its shape more distinct, more tangible. It wasn't just a silhouette anymore. It was a figure, tall and thin, its face twisted into an expression of malice. The eyes, those hollow pits, stared at me with such intensity that it felt like they were digging into my very soul. Its grin was wide, impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a grotesque mask. "You are mine," it whispered again, its voice slithering into my mind. It was no longer a distant sensation. It was real, standing right in front of me. The figure reached out a long, spindly hand, its fingers stretched and curling toward me. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, seeping into my skin, freezing my blood. The room seemed to collapse around me, the walls bending inward, the floor beneath my feet trembling. The air was thick with something ancient, something evil. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness. But then the whisper returned, louder, more forceful. "You will never escape." I felt my body tremble with the words, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was too thick, the pressure too great. And then, in an instant, the figure lunged at me. But before it could reach me, something snapped. The pressure in my chest, the weight in the room, it all shattered. I gasped, breaking free from whatever held it on me, and for the first time, I was able to move. I ran, stumbling toward the door, my legs barely holding me up as I threw myself out of the room and down the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran through the house, my breath ragged, my mind a blur of panic. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, my legs burning with exhaustion. But even as I stood there in the cold, under the harsh light of the street lamps, I knew it wasn't over. The shadows still lingered, just beyond my vision, always watching. Always waiting. I didn't know what I had just faced, or what it wanted. But I knew one thing for sure, it would never leave me. The darkness had claimed me, and no matter where I went, it would follow. And I would never be truly alone again. The shadows on the ceiling had become my shadow, and they were always with me. Have you ever wondered what might happen if you could see your future? Not just hints, but actual details, events that would unfold, words you would hear, decisions you would make. I thought I'd always be curious, but nothing could have prepared me for the day I began receiving letters from mine. It started like any other Monday. The mailman, the dull sound of footsteps on my porch. I didn't think much of it when the letter arrived. It was thick, its edges worn, like it had traveled a long way. The envelope was plain, no return address, just my name, neatly written in blue ink. I had no idea who it could be from. The date on the letter read 2026. That was impossible. I don't even know why I opened it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a strange feeling of inevitability. But when I unfolded the letter and read the first sentence, my stomach dropped. You will find a phone in the park tomorrow, near the old fountain. I sat there, staring at the words. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but strangely familiar. As if it belonged to someone I knew. Someone close. But the details, it wasn't just that the letter was from the future, it was the certainty. The simplicity of the statement. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. I had planned to visit that park the next day, but this was different. This wasn't some vague prediction. It felt personal. I thought about throwing it away. I wanted to forget about it, dismiss it as some sick joke. But something kept me from doing that. That voice inside, the one we always ignore, but in moments like these, it's impossible to ignore. It was telling me to wait. To see. The next day, I went to the park. And there, by the old fountain, I found the phone. I froze when I saw it, exactly where the letter said it would be. Black, slightly worn, as if it had been there for a while. It wasn't mine. I didn't know who would leave something like that, but the letter had been right. Too right. I reached down, hesitated for just a moment, and then picked it up. It was surprisingly warm. I turned it over in my hands, wondering what to do next. And then it vibrated, as if responding to my touch. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The phone rang. I answered it, my heart hammering in my chest. Hello? A pause. Then, a voice strangely familiar, but not someone I could place. Do not trust what you see. It will all fall apart soon. You have to act before it's too late. The line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, unable to speak. What just happened? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. What did it mean? And what was going to fall apart? I couldn't ignore it anymore. The connection between the letter, the phone, and the voice, it was becoming too real to dismiss. There was something deeper going on, something far beyond a simple coincidence. That night, another letter arrived. The handwriting was the same. The date was now 2027. The stranger will knock on your door. Don't let him in. The warning was simple, direct. And as the night wore on, the unease began to settle in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't even tell anyone about it. If I did, they would think I was losing my mind. But I couldn't stop myself from feeling that whatever was happening, it was leading to something. Something dangerous. And then, just as I had feared, the knock came. At first, it was soft. I ignored it. I told myself I was just imagining things. But the knocking continued, louder this time, urgent. I approached the door cautiously, every muscle in my body tense. My heart thudded in my chest as I peered through the peephole. There was no one there, only the emptiness of the night. But the moment I opened the door, I felt it. The shift in the air. Like something had just crossed the threshold, an invisible force pressing down on me. I stepped back, the door creaking open. There was nothing but the empty hallway. And then I saw it. A letter on the ground. The same handwriting. The same warning. You will regret this. I felt a chill race down my spine. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. And I realized then, this wasn't just a game. These letters, these events, they were all leading me to something I couldn't yet see. A future I wasn't prepared for. But I had no choice but to follow it, because now I knew there was no way out. The letter had left me unsettled, my heart still pounding from the shock of its words. But I couldn't escape the strange pull to the park, and I couldn't stop thinking about the phone. It had been there, exactly as the letter had described, and even though I had tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, something inside me kept whispering that this wasn't normal. It wasn't a game. There was something much bigger unfolding here, something I couldn't understand. The night passed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phone lying there by the fountain, the warmth of it still in my hands. The voice on the other end of the line echoed in my mind, "Do not trust what you see. It will all fall apart soon." What did that mean? What was I supposed to do with this cryptic warning? How could I make sense of it? I didn't know who the voice was, but it felt like it knew me, like it knew my life better than I did. It had spoken with such certainty, as though it had already seen the future and was trying to guide me. But guide me toward what? And from what? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread weighing on me. The air felt thicker, like the calm before a storm. The usual hum of daily life seemed distant, out of reach, as if I were living in a world just slightly out of alignment with reality. I forced myself to go about my day, ignoring the nagging voice in the back of my mind. I tried to tell myself that I was just tired, that it was all just stress. But nothing felt normal anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed by eyes I couldn't see. By the afternoon, I could no longer ignore the strange urgency in the pit of my stomach. I had to go back to the park. It was the only thing that felt right, the only thing that seemed to matter. The letter had been accurate about the phone, so surely it would be accurate about whatever was next. When I arrived, the park was quiet, empty, save for a few scattered people. The old fountain stood just as I remembered, weathered by time but still functional, the water gently trickling out. I stood there for a moment, looking around, before I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. There, on the ground near the fountain, was a phone. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same phone, the same black casing, the same worn edges. It wasn't the same phone I had found yesterday. But somehow, it was. There was no mistaking it. I hesitated, staring at it for a long moment. The words from the letter ran through my mind. The stranger will knock on your door. Don't let him in. A chill ran through me. Was this phone connected to that warning somehow? Was it a part of something bigger that I didn't yet understand? I couldn't just leave it there. I couldn't let it be. My hands trembled as I reached down, picking it up. It felt warm, much like the last one had, as though it had just been used. I turned it over in my hands, my eyes scanning for any signs that it was ordinary. The screen flickered to life as I held it. A text message appeared on the screen. You are not alone. I froze. The words sent a shockwave of fear through me, leaving me breathless. How did it know what I was thinking? Who was sending me these messages? Before I could process it, the phone vibrated again. Another text. The one who knocks will find you soon. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. Who could be behind this? How did they know about the warning from the previous letter? Was this all connected? Or was it just random? Then, the phone rang. I stared at the screen, hesitating before answering it. The same voice from before, cold, familiar, like it had been in my head all along, spoke. It's time. You can't avoid it any longer. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, something I couldn't control. But whatever it was, I couldn't run from it. I was already too deep. The voice paused, as if waiting for me to respond. The stranger is coming, it said softly. The door will open whether you want it to or not. And with that, the call ended. The line went dead, and the phone went silent in my hands. I stood there, frozen, staring at the device. My fingers clenched around it, and I could feel the weight of everything that was unfolding. There was no going back now. I had to know what was happening, even if it meant facing things I wasn't ready for. The warning had been clear. The stranger was coming, and I had no choice but to face whatever was about to happen. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I was no longer in control. The path I was on had already been set, and the only thing left was to see where it would lead me. The afternoon passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. The phone still felt warm in my hand, its strange messages echoing in my mind. It was like I was waiting for something to happen, something inevitable. Every sound outside my apartment, every shift in the air, made my pulse quicken. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The letter had been clear. The stranger will knock on your door. Don't let him in. But who was this stranger? What did he want? The more I tried to convince myself that it was all just some elaborate prank, the more the words gnawed at me. It wasn't a joke. This felt real. Too real. The phone had spoken, the messages had been delivered, and they weren't random. They were meant for me. I couldn't escape this feeling, the sensation that something, someone, was out there, watching me. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until the sun began to set that the true weight of the situation hit me. The house seemed darker than usual, even though the light outside hadn't completely faded. The shadows grew longer, creeping across the walls like they were alive. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. I couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. Something was coming, and I wasn't ready for it. I tried to distract myself by making tea, but even this simple act felt off. My hands shook as I poured water into the kettle, and the sound of the steam hissing in the kitchen seemed too loud. The weight of the phone in my pocket was a constant reminder of everything I couldn't understand. Then it came. A knock at the door. Quiet, almost tentative at first. The kind of knock you might ignore. But then it came again, louder, sharper, as if the person on the other side was impatient, eager. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I stood frozen in place. The kettle continued to whistle, but I didn't hear it. The knocking was all I could hear, louder now, each strike echoing in the silence of my apartment. The door. I knew I shouldn't answer it. The letter had warned me. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand moved on its own, trembling as it reached for the doorknob. I paused before turning it, my heart hammering in my chest. What if I was too late? What if the stranger had already come inside? The knock came again, more insistent this time, and I couldn't hold back any longer. My hand gripped the knob and twisted it open. The moment the door swung open, I froze. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me, the dim lighting casting long, sinister shadows on the floor. The doorframe felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just beyond my vision, hiding in the shadows. I stepped out cautiously, my eyes scanning the empty hall. The building was silent, except for the distant hum of a refrigerator from one of the other apartments. Nothing unusual, but my instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. I looked down at the floor. A letter. Another one. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. You were always meant to answer the door, but you weren't supposed to open it. I gasped, the words striking me like a blow. The message was clear. Whoever had sent this wasn't playing games. They knew everything. And now, they knew I'd made a choice. The silence around me grew deeper. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, closer, as though they were creeping toward me, inch by inch. Suddenly, I felt the coldness. A coldness that wasn't from the night air, but from something far darker. Something that was here with me. And then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound. It came from behind me, slow and deliberate, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. I turned quickly, heart racing. But there was nothing. Only the stillness, the empty hallway, the closed doors to the other apartments. But the cold, it was stronger now, pressing against me, as though it were closing in from all sides. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching into unnatural shapes. The very air felt thick, heavy, like I was standing underwater. I felt dizzy. The walls seemed to pulse. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. And then I heard it. A voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder. A cold, familiar voice. The one from the phone. You shouldn't have opened the door. The voice was closer now, just behind me, and I could feel the presence of something, or someone, standing right there, just beyond the edges of my vision. My heart pounded as I turned, but there was nothing. No one. I was alone. But I wasn't. The presence, the feeling of being watched, it was still there, like a weight pressing down on me. It was real. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know who was behind it. But I knew one thing for sure, the knock wasn't just a warning. It was the beginning. And I had no idea how far this would go. The room seemed to shrink around me as the shadows stretched across the walls. The air felt suffocating, like I was trapped in some kind of invisible web, unable to escape. The voice on the other side of the door, the one that had whispered my fate, was still echoing in my mind, chilling me to the core. You shouldn't have opened the door. But now it was more than just words. It felt like a curse, a fate that had already been sealed. I wasn't just hearing the voice. I could feel it, like cold fingers running down my spine, like a presence that hovered just out of sight, waiting for me to falter. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The knock had come again, but it wasn't at the door anymore. It was in my head, a slow, rhythmic tapping that matched the beat of my heart. Knock. 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 I felt the sound in my chest, vibrating through the air around me. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I glanced down at the letter in my hands. My fingers were cold and shaking, but I forced myself to read it again. The message was simple, chilling in its directness. You were always meant to answer the door, but you weren't supposed to open it. I didn't understand. If I wasn't supposed to open the door, then why had I? What had driven me to do it? The uncertainty, the fear, it was overwhelming. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows creeping ever closer, as if the apartment itself was closing in on me. I turned toward the hallway, half expecting to see the stranger standing there, waiting in the darkness. But there was no one. The space was empty, eerily so. A soft breeze swept through the apartment, carrying with it the faintest scent of something not quite right. It wasn't the usual smell of dust and wood, it was something older, something forgotten. My mind raced. What was that? What was I missing? And then, before I could process it, I heard it. A door. It creaked open somewhere in the hallway, though no one had touched it. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears. But there was nothing, no one. The door stood wide open, yet the hallway beyond was empty. It wasn't just strange. It felt like an invitation. I wanted to run, but my legs were heavy, frozen in place. The walls around me seemed to press in tighter, and the silence became deafening. It was as if the whole world had gone still, waiting for the next move. What was happening? I stumbled backward, the letter still clutched tightly in my hand. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the apartment, to escape whatever was happening. But I couldn't move. My feet felt stuck in the carpet, my body unwilling to follow the commands of my panicked mind. The whispering came again, this time louder. You should have stayed inside. I knew that voice. It was the same one from the phone. It was as if it had been with me all along, lurking in the corners of my mind, speaking words I didn't want to hear, telling me things I didn't want to know. It wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. A fate already set in motion. Suddenly, I felt it, a pressure, a weight against my chest, as though something was watching me from behind. I turned, and there it was. The stranger. He stood in the doorway, just outside the apartment, cloaked in shadows. His face was hidden, but I could see the outline of his figure, tall and unmoving. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched me, waiting. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. How had he gotten inside? The door had been locked. I hadn't heard him enter. But there he was, standing in front of me, and it felt like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. "Who are you?" I forced the words out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. Only silence. But that silence, it felt like a response. It was not a silence of absence, but one full of something darker, something waiting to be unleashed. He took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to follow him, like they were part of him, stretching and shifting with his every movement. The air grew colder, heavier. My skin tingled, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't matter. The stranger didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. He was the one who had been knocking at my door all this time. He was the one who had set everything in motion. And now, I had no choice but to face him. "You've opened the door," the voice from behind the stranger said, its echo traveling through the room. It wasn't his voice. It was something else, something older. Something far more terrifying. I felt my heart skip a beat. There was no turning back now. No escape. The stranger moved closer, the darkness surrounding him thickening, swallowing the light around us. The shadows twisted, taking form. I could see the outline of a hand, a cold, skeletal hand reaching toward me. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt like lead, anchored to the floor by the weight of the fear pressing down on me. And then, just before the hand touched me, the phone rang again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if it would help or make everything worse. But I reached for it, my fingers shaking as I answered. The voice on the other end was calm, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "You have to stop him. Before it's too late." But how? How could I stop what had already begun? How could I fight against something that seemed to know every step I would take before I took it? The phone went silent. The shadows closed in. And I realized there was no escaping it. No running. The stranger was here. And this time, he wasn't knocking. He was coming in. The phone fell from my hand, clattering to the floor with a sound that echoed through the still apartment. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unable to look away from the figure in the doorway. The stranger. The shadows around him shifted and writhed like something alive, closing in, creeping toward me. His presence was suffocating. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, turning it impossible to breathe. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, my fingers stiffening, my body trembling uncontrollably. He didn't move, didn't speak, he didn't need to. The air was thick with dread, with the weight of inevitability. "You have to stop him. Before it's too late." The voice on the phone, the one that had been my only connection to whatever this was, it was the only thing that still made sense in this twisted nightmare. Stop him? How? How could I stop something that was already here, already in my world? I forced my legs to move, my body fighting against the paralyzing terror that gripped me. I stumbled backward, eyes never leaving the stranger. The shadows around him grew longer, stretching toward me like they were reaching out to pull me in, to swallow me whole. The door behind me, my only escape, was right there. But the stranger was closer now, his figure becoming more defined, his silhouette sharper against the dimming light. He seemed to be growing, towering above me as the darkness seemed to pour from him, seeping into the very corners of the room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice had been stolen by the terror that choked me. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking. "He's already here." The voice wasn't from the phone this time. It wasn't even the stranger's. It was something different, something older. Something that had been waiting. The shadows around the stranger began to twist, forming shapes. Shapes that shouldn't have been. I saw a hand stretch out, not just from him, but from the darkness itself. It was pale, translucent, and wrong, as though it didn't belong to the world I knew. I reached for the door, my fingers desperate to touch the handle, but the shadows closed in too quickly. The stranger took another step forward, and the air grew impossibly colder. A gust of wind, icy, sharp, swept through the apartment, extinguishing the lights. The apartment plunged into darkness. And then I heard it. A door slamming shut, somewhere far away. A loud, final sound, like the closing of a coffin. It was the last thing I could focus on. The sound of the door closing. But it wasn't just a door in the building. It was the door to everything. To the path I had stepped into. I had opened the door. I didn't understand what had happened or what had been set in motion, but I knew one thing for certain: the choice had been made. The stranger, whatever he was, wasn't just in the apartment. He was in my mind. In my thoughts. He was part of everything now, part of the world I had known, and the one I would never truly understand. And with that realization came the most terrifying thought of all. The door was closing. It wasn't just the apartment door that was shutting. It was the door to my life. The door to everything I had once believed to be true. The door to my escape. There would be no going back. No return to the way things had been before. The stranger's figure loomed closer, and the shadows pressed in tighter. He was no longer just a figure at the door. He was inside me now, inside everything I thought I knew. And there was no door left to close. The last thing I saw before the darkness completely consumed me was the outline of his hand reaching out, cold and unfeeling. The knock had come. The door had opened. And I had walked right into it. I don't know why I never thought to ask myself why the lights always flickered before it happened. I only ever wondered how I ended up in those moments when the darkness closed in around me. It wasn't always the same, the sensation of being watched, but there was always that moment, the one where the room suddenly felt smaller, colder, darker. And then, there she was. At first, I convinced myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. I mean, who wouldn't, right? How could something be real if you couldn't even see it clearly? But then, the subtle shifts, the way she moved when I wasn't looking, told me a different story. I wasn't hallucinating, and I wasn't imagining it. She was real. I remember the first time I noticed her. I was sitting in my apartment, the usual hum of the refrigerator in the background, the glow of the lamp on the nightstand softly illuminating the space. The quiet was comforting. The kind of silence that made the apartment feel like my own little world, safe and untouched. Then the light flickered. It was subtle at first. A tiny blip, like the electricity was having a bad day. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was the old wiring in the building acting up again. But it flickered again, this time longer. The the kind of flicker that made the shadows dance unnaturally. And then, just as the light went out, I saw her. She stood in the far corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard to clear the haze. But when I opened them again, she hadn't moved. She was still there, watching me. Her figure was barely visible, more of a silhouette than a clear shape. But there was something in the way she stood, as if she was aware of me, studying me from the darkness. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. My body was frozen, my breath caught in my throat. And then the light came back on. I looked around the room. Everything seemed normal. The corner was empty, just a shadow in the farthest reaches of the apartment. I almost convinced myself it had all been a mistake, a trick of my mind, exhausted from the day. But I knew deep down something wasn't right. It was the second time the lights flickered that I realized I was no longer alone. This time, I felt it, a presence in the room, something that wasn't just a flicker in my tired eyes. My pulse quickened. I turned slowly, almost afraid to face what I knew would be there. There she was again, in the same corner. But this time, she was closer. I could see more of her now. Her shape was clearer, though still indistinct. She seemed to be wearing something, a long dark dress that flowed around her in an unnatural way, like it was made of the very darkness itself. Her face was a void, an empty space that seemed to stare into my soul. I wanted to call out, to shout, to ask her who she was, but my voice failed me. The air around me had thickened, suffocating me. The silence was deafening, pressing in on all sides, and the temperature had dropped. It was as if the darkness itself was closing in, not just from the corners of the room, but from within me, as if it was seeping into my very thoughts. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the rug beneath me, my mind screaming for me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The room was too small, the door too far. I couldn't escape her. I couldn't escape the feeling of her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see her face. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the lights flickered again, this time longer than before, and the power went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't see. But I could hear. I could hear the sound of breathing. My own breath. Rapid, panicked, coming in shallow gasps. But then there was another sound. It was soft, like the rustling of fabric, but it was unmistakable. She was moving. I held my breath, straining to hear, to make sense of the sounds in the pitch black. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the air shift. I wasn't alone. I could feel her, feel the space around me changing. The rustling stopped. The silence was unbearable. And then came the whisper. A voice so soft, so close, that it felt like it was inside my mind. You're not alone. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And in the blackness, I felt it, the feeling of her eyes on me once again, but this time I didn't have the strength to deny it. She was real. And she wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. I could feel her all around me in every breath I took. And I couldn't escape her. Because no matter how much I wanted to, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, I knew. The woman in the dark was not going to leave. She had found me. The air around me was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest, making each breath harder to take. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure it could be heard over the silence that had settled in the room. I wanted to move, to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening. It was as if the darkness had wrapped itself around me, holding me in place, trapping me in its grip. The whisper still lingered in my ears, like a soft echo that wouldn't fade. "You're not alone." The words repeated over and over in my mind, each time more insistent than the last. I could hear something, too. A subtle sound, like the faintest tapping, almost rhythmic. It wasn't my own breathing this time. No, this sound was closer, like it was coming from the other side of the room, or worse, right beside me. I tried to force myself to look, but my eyes felt as if they were glued shut. I could only listen, my ears straining to make sense of the noise in the dark. The tapping grew louder, closer. Then, the unmistakable sound of soft, dragging footsteps. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to do something, anything. But I couldn't. My voice had vanished, swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. And then, I heard it. A soft sigh, almost like a breath of wind, and the faintest rustling of fabric. The sound was unmistakable. She was moving again. Slowly. Deliberately. As if she knew I was too scared to move, too scared to stop her. I had to get out of there. I had to do something before she came any closer. My mind raced, but my body remained frozen. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, but the shadows seemed to shift, almost alive, as if they were hiding her from me. It was like she was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then came the most terrifying sensation of all. I wasn't alone in my head. I felt something, or rather, someone, watching me from the inside. A presence, so close, so intimate, that it felt as if it was part of me. I could feel her thoughts, her intentions, weaving into my own. It wasn't just her physical presence anymore, it was her mind, her will, her hunger. She wants something from me, I thought, but the thought wasn't entirely my own. It was hers, planted inside my mind, like a seed growing in the dark. I didn't know what she wanted, but I could feel it, the insatiable need that burned inside her, creeping into every thought I had, every action I considered. I could feel her hand, cold and unyielding, reaching into my thoughts. She was drawing closer, slowly but inevitably, closing the distance between us. And with each inch she moved, I could feel myself slipping further away from the reality I once knew. I tried to shake her out of my mind, to push her back, but it was like fighting against a tide. Her presence was too strong, too overwhelming. She was inside me now. "You're not alone," the voice whispered again. "I am with you." And then, finally, I saw her. In the deepest corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to swallow everything around it, there she stood. Her shape was no longer a faint silhouette, it was clearer now, like a shadow that had been pulled from the deepest pit of night. Her face was still hidden, her features obscured by the cloak of darkness. But I could feel her gaze, burning into me from behind that invisible mask. She wasn't just watching me now. She was waiting. The cold in the room deepened, and the walls felt like they were closing in. My breath came faster, more ragged, as I realized that there was nowhere to run. She had me trapped, not just physically, but mentally. I'm going to die in this room, I thought, but again, the thought wasn't mine. It was hers, pushing through me, making me believe it was the inevitable truth. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. But then, a part of me, some small, defiant part, screamed inside my mind, "No!" I had to break free. I had to fight back. I didn't know how, but I couldn't just let her take me. I looked around, desperate for anything that could help. My eyes landed on the lamp next to me. The one that had flickered before. The one that had betrayed me, plunging the room into darkness. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for it. The shadows around her moved, swirling, as if they were aware of my action. They pulled in closer, tightening, constricting, but I didn't care. I grabbed the lamp and yanked it from the table. The room flooded with light. For a brief moment, I thought I had won. The shadows retreated, the air lightened, and I could breathe again. But then, I saw her. She was closer now, only a few feet away. Her form was clearer than ever, and in the harsh light, I could see her face. It was no face at all. It was a blank, empty void, a black hole where features should have been. But I could feel her stare, as though her very essence was pressing into mine, suffocating me with her absence of life. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back. And then, in the silence that followed, I realized the terrifying truth. The light hadn't banished her. The light had only made her clearer. And now, there was no escaping. The air around me felt thick again, as if the very light had been swallowed by something darker, something older. The lamp in my hand trembled, and I nearly dropped it. I was too scared to look away, too terrified to move. Her presence was overwhelming. I could feel her there, standing in front of me, so close that I could almost feel her breath on my skin, though I couldn't see her face. The darkness behind her was too absolute, too complete. It pressed in on me, leaving no room for escape, no room to breathe, no place to run. But I didn't run. I couldn't. I was frozen, my body locked in place by the sheer force of her. My heart hammered against my chest, my pulse echoing in my ears, but I couldn't move. Not even an inch. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining me. The shadows swirled around her, undulating like a living thing, and I could feel them reaching for me, curling around my feet, my legs, like icy tendrils. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged itself somewhere deep inside me, caught in my throat, silenced by her presence. The longer I stared at her, the more she seemed to fill the space around me, like she was stretching herself to fill the room. The air grew colder. The walls seemed to pulse. The weight of her being was suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Time didn't exist in the space with her. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But nothing moved. Nothing changed. I was losing myself in her, feeling like I was fading, like my very essence was being pulled from me. I couldn't tell where I ended and she began. My thoughts felt clouded, as if something was muddling them, twisting them, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I was still in control of them. Then came the voice. Soft. Whispering. You can't escape, not from me. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was a statement of fact. It was final. I wanted to cry out, but I couldn't. I wanted to fight, to do anything to make her go away, but my body wouldn't obey. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but my feet were cemented to the ground. I was trapped in her gaze, or rather, in the void that was her gaze. Her eyes were black holes, pulling me deeper and deeper into them, draining me of everything. I can't escape, I thought, but again, it wasn't my thought. It was her thought. She was in my mind now, inside my very core, feeding on my fear, my despair, my helplessness. She was using me, using my thoughts to weave her power, to strengthen her hold. You are mine, the voice whispered again, its coldness seeping into my bones, sending a chill through me that no amount of light could ever banish. My mind was racing, spinning in a whirlwind of panic. No. No, I am not yours. I won't be. But the moment I thought it, I felt something shift inside me. A tremor. A spark. I had to fight. I couldn't let her take me. I couldn't give in to her. But how? The lamp. I was holding the lamp. The light was weak, flickering, but it was still there. I had to use it. I had to make it work. With trembling hands, I raised the lamp higher, toward her. My mind screamed for me to do it, to turn it into a weapon, to make the light stronger. The shadows around her recoiled for a moment, as though the light burned them. But then, they surged forward again, more aggressive, more determined. You can't fight me. The whisper wasn't in my ears anymore. It was in my mind. I could feel it wrapping itself around me, squeezing tighter, pushing me toward surrender. But there was a part of me, the tiniest spark of defiance, that refused to die. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a deep breath, and held the lamp up higher, praying for the light to grow stronger, praying for it to push her back. And then, something happened. The light flared. For a split second, it was brighter than I'd ever seen it, almost blinding, and for that moment, the shadows seemed to waver, to flicker and melt back into the corners of the room. The pressure that had been suffocating me loosened, just a little. I could breathe again. But it didn't last. The shadows snapped back into place, their edges sharp and jagged. They closed in around me, surrounding me. And she was right there, in front of me, her presence so overpowering that it felt like the very walls were closing in. I tried to scream, to cry out for help, but the air was thick and heavy. There was no one. No one would hear me. I was completely alone with her. No one can help you, she whispered, her voice an ice-cold caress. Her voice wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head. It was everywhere. I couldn't escape. The lamp flickered again, and I saw her face, just for a moment. A face that wasn't a face at all. It was a void. An endless, empty space, as though the very concept of a face had been erased from existence. And in that void, I saw something terrible, something that wanted to devour me. I wanted to look away. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. And then the light went out completely. Total darkness swallowed me. The lamp had failed, leaving me in a silent, oppressive blackness that felt far worse than any light could ever be. The air was thick and still. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling nothing but the suffocating void. My heartbeat was the only sound, loud and erratic in my ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. It couldn't be real, could it? The sense of her presence, the cold, the weight of her watching me. Surely, this was just a nightmare. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, the rustle of fabric, the faintest whisper of movement in the dark. It wasn't my own breath, my own shifts in position. No, it was something else. Something close. She was still here. I could feel the weight of her, even without seeing her. It pressed in from all sides, pulling the air from my lungs, making it harder to think, to act. My mind raced, trying to find any rational explanation, anything to make sense of the nightmare I was trapped in. But the more I thought, the more it felt as though the shadows were consuming me, erasing my thoughts one by one. I reached out, my hand trembling, but there was nothing. No walls. No furniture. Just emptiness. Then came the cold. It wasn't just the chill in the air. This was something worse, something more unnatural. It bit into my skin, crawling through my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I shuddered violently, my teeth chattering despite the sweat that now clung to my skin. "You can't escape me." Her voice. It was everywhere. Inside my mind, inside my body, whispering, echoing. I couldn't shut it out. It filled me, consumed me, and with each word, I felt myself slipping further from reality, further from myself. She was inside me. No. No. This isn't real. I clenched my fists, trying to force my body to move, trying to shake the feeling of her presence clinging to my very soul. But it was impossible. I was trapped. And then the sound came again, those soft, shuffling footsteps. They weren't in the distance this time. They were right beside me. So close I could feel them brushing against me. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her moving around me like an invisible predator, circling its prey. I have to move, I thought. I have to do something. I managed to drag my legs beneath me, pushing myself up, my hands reaching out in front of me. My fingers brushed against the cold walls, the rough texture of the wallpaper that had once been so familiar, so ordinary. Now it was like a cruel mockery of the reality I had known. It felt foreign. It felt like it didn't belong. "You can't escape." Her voice was louder now, but it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me, inside me, as though she was speaking directly into my mind. I shook my head violently, trying to clear it, trying to focus, trying to fight off the pull of her presence. My body was trembling, my teeth chattering, but I had to move. I had to escape. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from the darkness, but I didn't know where to go. The room felt like it was stretching, expanding, until it was endless. The shadows wrapped around me like a web, every corner, every inch, was suffocating me. Then, out of the silence, came a sudden crack, sharp and violent, like a bone snapping. I froze. My eyes strained against the darkness, but there was nothing. Only the thick, impenetrable blackness. "Don't look away." The whisper was so close now. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a feeling, a presence, something that pressed against my skull, that coiled into my thoughts, urging me to obey, to listen. And in that moment, I felt it. The air around me shifted. The pressure in the room changed, becoming heavier, denser. The very fabric of the darkness seemed to pulse, almost alive. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, of being studied. My hands shot out, feeling blindly for anything. Anything that could help. But there was nothing. The walls, the floor, the air, it all felt the same. Hollow. And then, I felt something, cold and soft, brush against my fingers. I gasped, pulling my hand back, but the sensation lingered. It was her. Her presence was so close now, I could almost touch it. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but there was no escape. The shadows clung to me, pressing in. Her voice, no longer a whisper, echoed through my mind, loud and deafening. I'm inside you now. I felt the words not just in my mind, but in my chest, in my soul. They weren't just spoken. They were felt. And I realized with horror that they were true. She had me. The room was spinning, the walls closing in, the dark tightening around me like a vice. The shadows that had once been distant were now right beside me, their presence suffocating, overwhelming. And then, something cracked again, louder this time. The walls, the floor, the very air itself seemed to fracture, splintering into pieces. I heard a voice. A low, guttural laugh. It wasn't hers. It wasn't mine. The darkness had taken on life of its own. Something more. And then, everything went silent. For a moment, it was as though I were suspended in time. As if the world had stopped turning, holding its breath. And in that silence, I realized one final, horrifying truth. I was no longer alone. Not in my mind. Not in this room. Not anywhere. And there was no escaping. The silence was unbearable. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. It was as if my throat had closed, as if the very air had turned to stone, trapping every sound inside me. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and frantic, but it felt distant, muffled. Like I wasn't even sure if it was mine anymore. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything except the ringing in my ears, but I could feel it. The weight of it. Her. She was still there. Even though I couldn't see her, I knew she was watching me, waiting. She wasn't just in the room. She was in me. A cold, twisted presence, gnawing at my thoughts. Her voice, once soft and whispering, now reverberated inside my mind like thunder, endless and deafening. It wasn't just her voice anymore. It was everything. Every crack in my thoughts. Every dark corner of my mind she could crawl into. You thought you could escape, but you never left. The words filled my head, as though they had always been there, lingering just beneath the surface of my consciousness. No, I thought, no, I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it. But she already knew. Her laughter returned, deep and guttural. I could feel it vibrating in my bones, shaking me to the core. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence. It was something other. Something ancient. The air around me grew colder, even colder than before. It bit into my skin, into my very soul. My teeth clattered together, my body shaking from the inside out. I couldn't stop it. It felt like the cold was filling me, seeping into every inch of my being, like I was becoming part of the darkness. I took a step backward, but I wasn't sure where I was going. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing. Just endless, suffocating darkness. You can't hide from me, she murmured. The sound slithered through my thoughts like a serpent, coiling, tightening, until I could hardly breathe. My legs gave way beneath me, and I crumpled to the floor. The chill from the shadows pressed against my skin, 1,000 cold fingers curling around my body, holding me in place. It felt like the darkness itself was dragging me down, pulling me deeper. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to block it all out. Please, I begged, please, let it stop. But there was no stopping it. No escape. You'll never be free of me, she hissed. And this time, there was no warmth in her voice. No human trace left. She was something else. My mind spiraled into chaos. I need to get out. I need to wake up. This can't be real. But deep down, I knew it was real. Too real. The laugh came again, louder this time, echoing through every part of me, until it was the only thing I could hear, the only thing I could feel. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and I felt like I was floating, slipping in and out of reality. Then, through the haze of panic, I felt something like fingers, cold and sharp, brush across my cheek. A touch, so gentle, yet so final, like a death sentence. "You will never escape," she whispered in my ear, her breath ice cold against my skin. I could feel the words burn their way through my mind, leaving behind a void, a silence that consumed me. And then, everything stopped. The darkness, the cold, the voices, they all disappeared. For one brief, terrifying moment, I was utterly alone. My heart raced, trying to catch up with the silence, with the stillness. But it was a lie. The moment didn't last. The cold returned, sharper now, cutting through me. And this time, I understood. It wasn't just a room. It wasn't just her. I was the darkness. I was the cold. I had been consumed. There was no waking up. No escape. I was trapped forever. And she would be with me, always. Have you ever looked at the time and felt like it was staring back at you? Like it knew something you didn't? It's strange how something as simple as a clock can make you feel so uneasy. It's just a tool, a way to measure the passage of time. But when you notice a change, something off, it becomes something else entirely. And when that clock becomes alive, that's when everything changes. I never believed in the supernatural. Never thought twice about the small things, the ticking of a clock, the hum of the fridge in the next room. That is, until I saw it. It started off small. Just a flicker, a tiny distortion on the face of my clock. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, clocks can malfunction, right? Maybe it was just dirt on the glass, or the light playing tricks on me. But the next day, when I checked again, it was still there. A thin, black line slashing through the face of the clock. At first, I thought it was a crack, but I could feel it. It wasn't just a blemish, it was moving. Every time I checked the clock, it was further along, marking a silent passage of time. I couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense. The line didn't seem to follow the numbers, it just slid across the dial, an ominous, creeping mark that never seemed to stop. It was subtle at first. You wouldn't notice it unless you were staring at it, but something about it felt wrong. It felt like the line was watching me, moving towards something. And the worst part? Every time the minute hand reached it, something inside me would shift. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. Something was changing. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on other things, work, friends, anything to push it from my mind. But the line on the clock kept moving, inching closer to the next minute, and each time it did, the tension in the room grew thicker. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but I couldn't see it. It was just there, pressing down on me. That night, I decided to stay up late, to watch the clock and see what would happen. As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't help but fixate on the line. The sound of the clock's ticking was louder than usual, each second stretching on for what felt like forever. It was as though the clock was counting down to something, but to what? The line on the clock had reached the number 10. I watched as the minute hand crept toward it. My breath caught in my throat. Something was going to happen. I didn't know what, but I felt it deep in my bones. When the minute hand touched the line, everything changed. The air grew colder. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me. I jumped back, startled. It wasn't possible. The heating had been on all evening. This wasn't normal. And then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails on glass. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was coming from the clock. It was as though the black line was moving again. No, it was sliding. I dared not take my eyes off the clock. The second hand had begun to twitch, stuttering every time it reached the line. And then it happened. The clock let out a sharp snap, like a switch being flipped. The black line seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something shift behind the glass. Something dark. My skin crawled. The clock's minute hand was still moving, but now the line was growing. Stretching. Spreading. It wasn't just marking time anymore. I couldn't look away. I had to know what was happening. My hands were clammy, my breath shallow, but I couldn't tear myself from the clock's face. It felt like I was being drawn into it, like the clock wasn't just measuring time, but controlling it. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't just the clock. It was coming from all around me. The room felt smaller, tighter, like something was closing in. The clock's minute hand had reached 11. The line was almost complete. That's when I noticed it. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. I stared at the room, my breath shallow, but the feeling remained. Something was waiting. The line on the clock was now completely across the face. The second hand was shaking, trembling as if it were struggling to move. The sound of the clock was deafening now, its ticking accelerating, filling the room, filling my mind. I stood up abruptly, the sudden motion making me dizzy. My eyes never left the clock as I reached for my phone. The clock's hands were frozen in place, stuck at 11:30. The seconds seemed to stretch out, like time itself was being held prisoner. And then, without warning, the line started to move again. Slowly. Deliberately. It was coming for me. And I didn't know how to stop it. The clock had changed, and now it seemed like everything around me was following suit. The world felt wrong. Twisted. Out of sync. I turned toward the door, but I couldn't leave. The clock had me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the clock. The line was still creeping across its face, slowly but surely, and with every tick, the air in the room grew heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. I tried to step back, to break my gaze, but it was like the clock was pulling me in. The second hand shook, as if it, too, was aware of the strange presence that had entered the room. Every tick sounded louder now, sharper, like the clock was counting down to something inevitable. I glanced at the door, but it felt miles away. The room seemed to stretch, warping and distorting with every passing second. I couldn't breathe properly. My lungs felt tight, restricted by an invisible force. I reached for my phone again, my hands trembling. But when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. The time was frozen. 11:30. I stared at the glowing numbers, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The time should have been moving, ticking forward, but the screen was stuck. It was as if time itself had halted, as if the clock had stopped everything. The air felt too still, too silent. But then, out of nowhere, a soft whisper filled the space. It was faint at first, like the wind rustling through leaves, but the words were unmistakable. "It's too late." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper seemed to come from all around me, as if the very walls were speaking. I turned around, searching the room, but there was no one there. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away from the clock. What was happening? The line on the clock moved again, stretching further, now reaching the 12 o'clock mark. The second hand twitched. And that's when I noticed it. The reflection in the window. I hadn't seen it at first, but now it was impossible to ignore. The glass of the window wasn't just reflecting the room, it was reflecting something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. In the reflection, there was a figure. A silhouette, dark and indistinct, standing just behind me. The figure was blurry, like smoke, but there was no mistaking it. It was there, watching me, and it was moving closer. My breath hitched, and I turned around so quickly that I nearly stumbled. But when I looked, there was nothing. I stared at the window again. The figure was gone, but I knew it was still there. Somewhere. I rushed to the door, grabbing the handle and yanking it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, but I hadn't locked it. I hadn't touched it. What the hell was going on? The clock's ticking became more erratic, like a countdown. The second hand was racing, its movement frantic now, as if it was trying to outrun something. But there was no escaping it. The line on the clock was moving faster, now crossing the entire face in a fluid motion, as though it was no longer bound by time. Tick, tick, tick. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally along the walls. The air grew thick with the scent of something foul, something metallic. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my breath growing shallow. And then, a voice. A low, guttural whisper, this time directly behind me. "You shouldn't have looked." I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, but once again, there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. Just the walls, the clock, and me. But it wasn't just the voice that terrified me. It was the feeling. The sensation that I wasn't alone. That something was there, just out of sight. Something that was waiting. The clock, now, was spinning uncontrollably. The black line blurred as it moved, warping the time itself. The minute hand was shaking violently, and the second hand had stopped altogether, frozen on the edge of the black mark. And then it all stopped. Dead silence. The clock was completely still, but the air was thick, heavy, as if time had stopped entirely. I felt dizzy, disoriented. It was like everything I had known, everything I trusted about the world, was slipping away. The line on the clock had disappeared, but it felt like it had left something behind. Something worse. The whisper came again, clear this time, almost like a command. "You can't undo it." My stomach twisted. The clock hadn't just altered time, it had warped it. It had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, and I was standing right in the middle of it. Every second felt like it was stretching and collapsing at the same time. I stepped back, trying to collect myself, but my legs wouldn't move. The room felt like it was spinning around me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but the truth was clear. I wasn't in control anymore. Time was no longer something I could understand or escape from. It was something else. And as the room started to shift, warp, and twist, I realized I had no idea what would happen next. But I knew one thing for certain. It was only a matter of time. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that oppressive silence. The clock had stopped, but time, if it could still be called time, was moving in a way I couldn't comprehend. I felt like I was in the middle of a dream, or maybe a nightmare, where the rules no longer applied. My hands were trembling as I reached out to touch the clock, expecting it to be cold, lifeless. But instead, it was warm. Warm in a way that felt wrong. Like it was pulsing with some unnatural energy, something that shouldn't exist. I pulled my hand back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The room around me was so still, so quiet, but in the back of my mind, I could hear something faint. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. It wasn't mine. It was too far away, yet it felt close, as if it were coming from deep inside the walls themselves. Thump, thump, thump. I glanced toward the window again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection. A shadow flickered in the corner, but when I turned to face it, there was nothing. Only the empty, familiar room that seemed, somehow, less familiar than before. I felt my chest tighten. My thoughts were scattered, panicked. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But the door wouldn't open. It had locked itself, or perhaps something had locked it. I couldn't be sure. And then, suddenly, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, heart racing, but again, there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. Just the room and the oppressive silence pressing down on me. But I felt it. It was there. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was. The thumping grew louder, more urgent now, like something was pounding from the other side of the wall, trying to break through. My pulse raced as I staggered backward, trying to find a way to escape. I reached for the door again, my fingers slick with sweat as I gripped the handle, but it refused to budge. Then, without warning, the clock began to tick again. It wasn't a regular ticking. It was sharp, uneven, each tick sounding like a hammer against my skull. The second hand twitched violently, jerking forward and then stopping, only to jerk again. The black line was gone now, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. And then the whisper came. "It's coming." The words slid into my ears, cold and smooth, like ice water running down my spine. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room warping and distorting again, pulling me into some other place. The air was thick, like I was drowning in it. Every second felt like it was being stretched into eternity. The thumping wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside the clock. I backed away from it, fear flooding my mind, but I couldn't look away. The clock's face was shifting, the numbers warping and twisting as if they were trying to escape. The second hand moved again, faster this time, its motion a blur. It was racing toward the black mark, and I knew, deep down, that when it reached it, something would break. Something had to break. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my head spinning. The whisper was louder now, almost deafening, filling my mind with words I didn't understand, but somehow, I knew them. "It's too late. You're too late." I looked back at the door. Still locked. I pounded on it with my fists, but it didn't even rattle. The room felt like it was alive, like it was changing around me, bending and twisting to its own will. I wasn't in control. I never had been. The clock's hands were moving faster and faster, spinning wildly now, and the air around me began to hum. It felt like the room was vibrating, like it was about to tear open at the seams. I could see the walls warping, bending like liquid, and I realized it wasn't the room that was changing. It was me. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable. My legs were weak, trembling as if they couldn't hold me up anymore. The ticking was growing louder, more frantic, the sound reverberating in my skull. And then, just as the second hand reached the black line again, I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper this time. A scream. It wasn't my own. It came from the clock. From the very heart of it. The sound tore through the room, through me, like a blade of pure fear. I clutched my ears, trying to block it out, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere, all around me, and the darkness it created was suffocating. The room was swallowed by it. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the clock stopped again. Dead silence. The walls stopped moving. The hum disappeared. The air was still, suffocating, and I could hear nothing but the beating of my own heart. But something was wrong. The room was different. It was no longer the room I had known. The walls were unfamiliar, the shadows deeper, like they were waiting. Watching. I had no idea where I was anymore. But I knew one thing. The clock had changed everything. And whatever had been waiting for me was now closer than ever. The silence in the room was unbearable. I stood in the middle of it, frozen, my breath shallow and quick. The clock loomed on the wall, no longer ticking, no longer moving. Its face was blank, completely empty. The numbers in the hands were gone, leaving only a smooth, black surface that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't look away. It held me in place, an invisible force pressing on my chest. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but every instinct screamed that moving would make things worse. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a low hum, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear, a rhythmic tapping, coming from within the clock. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded organic, like knuckles rapping on wood. Someone, or something, was inside. I stumbled backward, my gaze locked on the clock. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, echoing in the room like a heartbeat. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the desk for support, but the surface felt strange, rough and cold, as though it had aged 100 years in mere seconds. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive air. I didn't expect an answer, and yet a voice responded. "Open it." The words were clear, sharp, and chilling. They didn't come from the clock. They came from everywhere at once, above me, behind me, inside me. I whipped around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, I won't." The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, the black surface of the clock began to ripple, as though it were made of liquid. A single crack formed at the center, spreading outward like a web. I took a step back, my foot catching on the corner of the rug. I fell hard, the impact jarring my senses. But the pain was distant, overshadowed by the growing sense of dread as the crack widened, revealing a sliver of something beneath, something dark and shifting. The voice returned, louder this time. "You can't stop it. Open it." My mind screamed to resist, to fight, but my body moved on its own. My hands reached out, trembling as though drawn by an invisible thread. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became until my fingers brushed the surface of the clock. It was cold. So cold it burned. The crack widened further, splitting the clock in two. Darkness spilled out, thick and heavy, like smoke but denser, more alive. It coiled around my wrists, pulling me closer, and for a moment I thought I saw eyes, glinting, malevolent eyes staring back at me from the void. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness surged forward, enveloping me, and suddenly, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was falling. The world around me was a blur of shadows and whispers, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and despair. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. My body felt weightless, yet the pressure was crushing, as though the void itself was trying to consume me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was standing again, but the room was different. It was the same space, yet everything about it felt wrong. The walls were cracked and decayed, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The clock was still there, but it was no longer on the wall. It stood on the floor, towering over me like a monolith. Its surface was no longer black but mirrored, reflecting a distorted version of myself. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror. But the reflection didn't match my movements. It smiled. I stumbled back, but the reflection stepped forward, its grin widening. The mirror began to ripple, the distorted version of me pressing against the surface as though trying to break through. "No," I gasped. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The reflection laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. The voice from before returned, softer now, but no less menacing. "Time is up." The mirror shattered, and the shards flew toward me, dissolving into shadows before they could touch my skin. The room was plunging into darkness again, the edges of my vision blurring. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. And then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. It wasn't human. The touch was cold, claw-like, and it tightened its grip as a voice whispered directly into my ear. "You should have listened." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void as the darkness consumed me once more. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my room, staring at the ceiling. My body ached, and my head throbbed as though I had been struck by something heavy. For a moment, I thought it was all a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying dream that had somehow seeped too deeply into my mind. But then I saw the clock. It was back on the wall, just as it had been before, its hands ticking along as if nothing had happened. The black smudge was there too, larger now, stretching across nearly half of the clock's face. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The room was quiet, unnervingly so. The faint hum of electricity, the distant sound of traffic, everything was gone. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things. But when I looked down, my hands were covered in faint black streaks, as if the darkness from the clock had left its mark on me. I got to my feet, my legs shaky. Every instinct told me to leave, to get as far away from this cursed object as possible. But where would I go? The clock had made it clear there was no escaping it. The hands were moving faster now, the ticking growing louder. I could feel it reverberating through my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. The black smudge crept closer to the center of the clock, swallowing the numbers one by one. Panic set in as I realized what it meant. When the smudge reached the center, when the clock struck whatever time it was counting down to, something would happen. Something irreversible. I grabbed the clock, yanking it off the wall. It was heavier than it should have been, the weight pressing down on my arms like lead. I slammed it onto the ground, desperate to break it, to stop whatever was coming. The glass cracked, but the hands didn't stop. They spun wildly now, the ticking becoming a deafening roar. The smudge spread faster, devouring the face of the clock entirely until there was nothing left but blackness. And then it stopped. For a moment, the room was still. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Just as I began to think it was over, the blackness spilled out of the clock. It poured onto the floor like liquid, spreading in all directions, climbing the walls and ceiling. The room darkened until I could barely see, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. No response. Just the footsteps, growing louder, closer. The shadows shifted, forming shapes, vague outlines of figures that seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. One by one, they stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. Their faces were indistinct, but their presence was overwhelming. I backed into the corner, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But the figures were too solid, too present. One of them spoke, its voice a chilling echo that seemed to come from the depths of the void. "Time has been claimed." The figures advanced, their movements slow but deliberate. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The darkness coiled around my limbs, holding me in place as they closed in. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, no." The tallest figure reached out, its hand extending toward me. Its touch was ice cold, sending a shock through my entire body. My vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into blackness. And then, just as I thought it was over, the figure stopped. The tallest one leaned in, its face mere inches from mine. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me, as if it were staring directly into my soul. "You were warned," it said, its voice low and menacing. "Now you belong to the clock." The darkness surged forward, swallowing me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room. The clock was gone, and everything seemed normal, too normal. But I knew better. I could feel it in the air, in the weight pressing down on me. The clock wasn't gone. It was inside me now, ticking away silently, counting down to something I couldn't begin to comprehend. And I knew, deep down, that when the time came, there would be no escaping it. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, certain you're not alone, only to find nothing but silence? That's how it started for me. A subtle feeling, like someone was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It was harmless at first, easy to dismiss as a product of an overactive imagination. But then came the lights. It was late, probably around 3 in the morning, when I saw the first one. A faint, flickering glow danced across the wall opposite my bed. At first, I thought it was a reflection, headlights from a passing car, or maybe a glitching street lamp outside my apartment. But when I got up to check, I found nothing. The street outside was dark, empty. Returning to my room, I froze. The glow was back, brighter now, forming distinct shapes. Letters. Are you awake? The words pulsed in a soft, neon blue light, hovering just above the wall. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a projection. The letters seemed embedded in the surface, as though they were etched into the paint itself. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was dreaming, but the glowing question remained. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the words. Then, as if responding to my silence, they flickered and rearranged themselves. Do you see US? A shiver ran down my spine. Us? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The glow dimmed, and the letters dissolved into swirling streaks of light, reforming into an unfamiliar symbol, an intricate, geometric design that seemed to pulse with energy. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like it was trying to draw me closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, reaching out. The moment my fingers brushed the wall, a surge of cold shot through my body. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The lights vanished, leaving the room pitch dark. For a moment, I thought it was over, a bizarre hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But then I heard it, a faint humming sound, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, scanning the room, but saw nothing unusual. The hum grew louder, resonating through the floorboards, the walls, even the air itself. It felt alive, almost sentient. Suddenly, the lights returned, not on the walls this time, but floating in midair. They spiraled and twisted, forming shapes that were both mesmerizing and unsettling. Images flickered within the neon glow, fragments of places I didn't recognize, faces I'd never seen. One face lingered longer than the others, a pair of glowing eyes set against an inky black void. They stared directly at me, unblinking. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The lights pulsed in response, and the message appeared again, brighter and more urgent. Do you see US? My knees buckled, and I sank onto the edge of the bed. Yes, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was answering them or trying to convince myself. I see you. The lights dimmed, and the room fell silent once more. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was thick, oppressive, filled with an unspoken tension. I could feel them, whoever or whatever they were, watching me from the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing eyes staring back at me, the words burning into my mind. By morning, the lights were gone, and the apartment seemed normal again. But I knew better. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The next night, I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream. I threw myself into work during the day, drank too much coffee, and avoided my apartment until late in the evening. By the time I got home, exhaustion had taken hold. I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, too tired to do anything but stare at the ceiling. The memory of the glowing letters lingered in my mind, but the rational part of me fought to dismiss it. Stress, I muttered aloud. That's all it was. I repeated it like a mantra, hoping the words would hold power over whatever madness had gripped me. But as the clock crept toward midnight, I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural, suffocating. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant murmur of the city outside. Even my breathing felt muted. Then came the first flicker. A faint, almost imperceptible flash of light near the far wall. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Not again," I whispered. This time, the light didn't form words. Instead, it took the shape of a doorway, a glowing rectangle etched in pale blue light, standing upright in the middle of the room. It shimmered and pulsed, as though inviting me to step closer. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but my legs seemed to move on their own. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around the doorway felt charged, like static electricity before a storm. I peered into the glow, expecting to see my reflection, or nothing at all. But what I saw on the other side wasn't my apartment. It was a street, drenched in neon light. The buildings were tall and angular, their surfaces covered in shifting symbols and glowing advertisements in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath the lights seemed wet, reflecting the colors in surreal patterns. The street was empty, except for one figure standing in the distance. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was facing me, watching. I staggered back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The glowing doorway began to flicker, as though it were unstable. For a moment, I thought it might disappear entirely. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "Stay there." It took another step, and another, its movements slow but deliberate. The closer it got, the more distinct its outline became, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. The glowing doorway pulsed brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The figure was almost at the threshold now, its face still obscured by the glare. "Stay back," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. The figure paused, tilting its head as if it were listening. For a brief, maddening moment, I thought it might obey. But then it stepped through the doorway. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. The figure stood motionless, its face still hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, pointing directly at me. The neon symbols on the walls began to reappear, shifting and swirling in chaotic patterns. Words formed, dissolving just as quickly, like the lights were struggling to convey something. Finally, a single phrase solidified, glowing in bold red letters. "Run." Before I could react, the lights in the room exploded into a blinding flash, and everything went dark. When I woke up, it was morning. The glowing doorway was gone, and my apartment was bathed in pale sunlight. But the words still lingered on the wall, faint and flickering like the dying embers of a fire. "Run." This wasn't a dream. It was real, and whatever had come through that doorway was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I spent the next day in a haze of paranoia, jumping at every shadow and avoiding my apartment as long as I could. By the time the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't escape returning. Something inside me whispered that staying away wouldn't change anything. Whatever was happening, it was tied to me. The moment I walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick, oppressive, and there was that same unnatural silence I'd felt before. I wanted to turn around and leave, but my body felt rooted to the spot. The lights began almost immediately. This time, they weren't confined to the walls. The entire room filled with faint, swirling colors, pale blues, sharp reds, and deep purples, dancing and blending like the aurora borealis. It was beautiful and horrifying all at once. The symbols returned, larger and more vivid than before, hovering in midair. They shifted and twisted, forming a message that sent a chill down my spine. Time is running out. What do you want from me? I shouted into the glowing chaos. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the electric hum that filled the room. The lights dimmed briefly, and then the doorway reappeared, this time on the ceiling, glowing brighter than ever. The strange city was there again, its neon streets alive with shifting colors. But now, the figure wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy forms filled the street, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They turned their heads in unison, staring up at me through the portal. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green that seemed to pierce right through me. The words changed again, flickering urgently. You must choose. Choose what? My voice cracked with desperation. I don't understand. The shadows moved closer, their steps silent but heavy with intent. The humming grew louder, vibrating through my chest. I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the far wall. The symbols began to rearrange rapidly, forming images instead of words. I saw myself, standing in the same spot, but the room behind me wasn't my apartment. It was a void, endless and dark, dotted with faint neon trails. The figure from before stood beside me in the vision, its elongated limbs hovering unnervingly close. The image dissolved, replaced by another, the same city from the portal, but now consumed by fire. The buildings crumbled, the neon lights sputtering and dying. The figures screamed, their glowing eyes extinguished one by one. The final message appeared, bold and unrelenting. Save or destroy. The lights flickered violently, and the doorway began to collapse in on itself. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked into a vacuum. I had seconds to decide. If I stepped through the portal, I might find answers, or I might never come back. If I stayed, the chaos could consume me entirely. Heart pounding, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The light enveloped me, pulling me through the doorway. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding white. Then the world came rushing back, a cacophony of sounds, colors, and voices. I was standing in the neon city. The ground beneath me pulsed with energy, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone. The shadowy figures surrounded me, their glowing eyes fixed on mine. The first figure, the one I'd seen from the beginning, stepped forward. It raised a hand, pointing toward the horizon. In the distance, a massive structure loomed, an intricate tower of light and shadow. I didn't need words to understand. Whatever this place was, whatever choice I was meant to make, it waited for me there. And there was no turning back. The city felt alive beneath my feet. Every step I took sent ripples of light through the ground, as though the surface were a thin sheet of liquid energy. The figures surrounded me, silent and watchful, their glowing eyes tracking my every move. The tower loomed in the distance, a jagged spire of black and neon, twisting unnaturally against the dark sky. It pulsed with a rhythm I could feel in my chest, like the heartbeat of something immense and ancient. I hesitated. What happens if I go there? I asked, though I knew none of the figures would answer. As if in response, the symbols returned. They materialized in the air, glowing a sharp crimson. Decide. The figures parted, creating a narrow path that led directly toward the tower. It felt like a procession, a ritual I hadn't agreed to but was now bound to complete. The air grew heavier the closer I got, filled with an electric hum that set my nerves on edge. The neon lights on the buildings flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that danced and twisted in impossible shapes. When I reached the base of the tower, the doorway appeared again, an archway carved from pure light, pulsing in time with the tower's rhythm. Beyond it was darkness, impenetrable and vast. I hesitated. What if I choose wrong? I whispered to no one in particular. The message appeared again, this time larger and brighter, filling the space around me. There is no wrong choice. Only consequences. My legs felt like lead, but something compelled me forward. I stepped through the archway, and the world shifted around me. Inside the tower, the air was cold and sharp, like breathing in shards of glass. The walls were lined with glowing panels, each displaying scenes from lives that weren't mine, families laughing, people arguing, strangers walking through busy streets. I stopped in front of one panel that showed my own apartment. It was as if I were watching a recording of my life. I saw myself sitting on the couch, staring at the wall where the first symbols had appeared. But there was something off, subtle at first, but unmistakable. In the reflection of the television screen, I saw the figure. It had been there all along, watching me. A chill ran down my spine as the panel shifted, showing another scene. This time, I was standing in the city, surrounded by the shadowy figures. They weren't watching me anymore. They were bowing. The final panel displayed a choice. On one side, the city burned, consumed by flames that devoured the neon lights. On the other, the city thrived, its lights growing brighter and more vibrant. A voice echoed in my mind, low and resonant. Choose your reality. I staggered back, overwhelmed. I don't understand. Why me? The panels darkened, and the room filled with a blinding white light. The voice spoke again, louder this time, shaking the very walls. Choose. My heart raced as I stepped toward the glowing controls at the center of the room. Two symbols hovered above it, a flame and a beam of light. My hand hovered between them, trembling. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The choice wasn't just about the city. It was about me, about what I was willing to sacrifice and what I was willing to save. With a trembling hand, I made my decision. The room erupted in light, and the world fell away. When I opened my eyes, the world was silent. The oppressive hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt heavier than any noise. I stood in the middle of the city, or what remained of it. The buildings were intact, their neon lights shining more brightly than before, but the streets were empty. The figures were gone. I looked at my hands, half expecting to find some mark, some proof of what had just happened, but they were unremarkable. The only thing that lingered was a faint tingling in my fingertips, like the aftershock of touching something electric. The tower was gone. Where it had once loomed, there was now only an empty sky, still dark but eerily calm. I started walking, calling out for anyone, any voice, any sign of life, but the city felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. As I wandered, I noticed something strange. The neon signs were no longer random. They didn't shift or flicker. Instead, they displayed words I could understand. You chose light. The message repeated itself on every building I passed, the words burning themselves into my mind. But something was wrong. As I continued, the signs began to change. The words twisted, their meanings warping. The light reveals all. Can you face what you've done? Panic clawed at my chest. The streets began to ripple beneath my feet, the neon lights casting unnatural shadows that stretched and twisted, forming shapes I didn't want to recognize. And then I saw it, my reflection. In the glass of a shop window, I saw myself, but it wasn't me. The figure staring back had glowing eyes, the same cold, piercing gaze as the shadowy beings from before. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. The reflection didn't move with me. It stayed in place, watching. And then it smiled. The city erupted in light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I shielded my eyes, but the brightness burned through my closed lids, searing itself into my mind. When the light finally dimmed, I was no longer in the city. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the couch, staring at the blank wall. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then I noticed the neon glow outside my window. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a reminder that the city, the tower, the choice had all been real. I glanced at the wall where the symbols had first appeared. Nothing. Just blank plaster. But as I stood to turn away, a single word materialized, glowing faintly in the dark. Watch. And then I heard it, a low hum, faint but unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. I looked at my reflection in the window. My eyes glowed softly, the same cold neon as the city I'd left behind. The message on the wall shifted, its meaning chillingly clear. You are the light now. The hum grew deafening as the room filled with blinding neon, and I understood. The choice I made wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, and it was far from over. It started with a question. Have you ever wondered what's hiding in the walls of your home? It sounds like a joke, doesn't it? But when I stumbled upon that hidden room, it was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was something else entirely. I had been working on a renovation project in my apartment. The kind of project you take on because something needs fixing, and you find yourself caught up in the dust and the mess, losing track of time. I had already stripped the wallpaper from the walls of the hallway when I noticed something strange. There was a door I didn't remember ever seeing before. At first, I thought I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I had been in and out of the hallway dozens of times, so how could I not have noticed this door? It was tucked away at the end of the corridor, almost hidden by the faded wallpaper. The door itself was plain, unremarkable. Nothing special about it at all, except for the fact that it didn't belong there. I reached out to open it. The handle was cold beneath my fingers. It creaked open with little effort, revealing a small, dimly lit room. No windows. No signs of life. Just silence. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I glanced around. The air felt heavier here, as if the room had been locked away for years. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, but something about it felt off. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, making it harder to breathe. I stood in the center of the room for a moment, trying to take it all in. The walls were bare, save for some old, faded wallpaper that had peeled in places. There was a faint smell of mildew, but nothing unusual. No furniture, no objects, just a bare, empty space. But then I heard it. At first, it was barely a sound, a faint creak, like a door moving in the distance. I looked around, expecting to see something shift, but the room remained still. I shrugged it off. Probably the house settling, I thought. It had been an old building after all. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. It wasn't a gust of wind. It wasn't an accident. It slammed with force, as though something, or someone, and made sure it closed. I jumped back, heart racing. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. From the inside. My breathing quickened, the air feeling even heavier now. I pressed my back to the cold wood of the door, my mind racing. What was going on here? How had I never noticed this room before? And why wouldn't the door open? A shiver ran down my spine, but I refused to panic. I had to stay calm. This was just some strange quirk of the house, some old mechanism malfunctioning. I would find a way out. I would find a way to. Another sound. This time, it was louder. A scrape, as though something was dragging across the floor behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just the empty, silent room. But I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of it, the feeling that something was wrong. That I wasn't alone. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear the sounds of the hallway outside, maybe someone passing by. But there was nothing. Just silence. I glanced around once more, my eyes landing on the walls. Something caught my attention, something faintly out of place. There, in the far corner, a shadow lingered, darker than the rest of the room. I took a step closer. The shadow didn't move. It was then that I felt it, a presence. Something watching me. My skin prickled. I reached for the handle again, my hands trembling. But no matter how hard I turned it, the door wouldn't open. The sounds, the shadows, they were growing. The room was closing in on me. It was then I realized this room, this forgotten place, wasn't just a part of the house. It was alive. I was trapped. The realization hit me with the force of a blow. No matter how hard I tried, the door wouldn't open. The silence in the room grew thicker, more suffocating, as if the air itself had turned against me. I pressed my ear to the cold wood again, hoping to hear something, anything, that would tell me I wasn't alone in this nightmare. Nothing. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. The shadow in the corner still didn't move. It was just there, clinging to the wall like a stain that wouldn't wash away. But now, I wasn't sure if it was a shadow at all. It felt wrong, somehow. Too still. Too solid. I moved toward it, my feet hesitant, as though the floor might give way under me at any moment. Each step felt like a small betrayal to my instincts, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. The closer I got, the more the shadows seemed to shift. At first, it was subtle, a slight distortion in the darkness, but as I neared, it became unmistakable. It was a figure. A tall, slender silhouette, standing still in the corner. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, thick and heavy. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and I took a careful step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't blink. But I could feel it now, its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, boring into me. I could almost hear its silent stare. For a moment, I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the sick fascination that kept me rooted to the spot. But then, a soft noise broke the tension. A creak. The floorboards behind me groaned under the weight of something. I spun around. Nothing. Just the same empty walls. The room was silent once more, but I could still feel the pressure around me. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening. This was just an old house. A house full of strange noises and unexpected drafts. The shadow, the sounds, it was all in my head, wasn't it? But the air had changed. It was colder now, biting at my skin, making my teeth chatter. I could feel it in my bones. The room was alive, pulsing with a strange energy I couldn't explain. And the door remained locked, mocking me. I turned back to the figure in the corner. It hadn't moved, but something had changed. There was a faint shift in the air, a subtle movement that made my skin crawl. I blinked and it was closer. Just a few feet away. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. How could it have moved so quickly? How could I have not noticed it? The figure leaned in closer, its outline becoming more defined, more real. I could see the faintest glimmer of a face, but it was twisted, distorted. Its features were all wrong, stretched and contorted in a way that made me want to look away. But I couldn't. My eyes were locked on it, as though something was forcing me to watch. A low whispering sound filled the room, so faint I thought it was just my imagination. But then it grew louder. A low, guttural voice that seemed to echo from all around me. "Stay with me." I staggered back, my hands scrambling for something, anything, to steady myself. My chest tightened, and the walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking around me. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that it wasn't just a voice. It was a command. I had to get out. But the room was shifting. The walls weren't the same as they had been just moments ago. They had grown taller, more oppressive. The ceiling was lower now, and the space was growing smaller, suffocating me with every passing second. I tried to force my way to the door again, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs were like lead, and every movement felt as though I was wading through thick mud. The whisper was growing into a chant, a rhythmic sound that made my thoughts scatter. "Stay with me. Stay with me." I slammed my fist against the door. The handle rattled, but still, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't just the door that was locked now. The whole room felt like it was holding me prisoner, as if it were pulling me into itself, trapping me inside its walls. The floor groaned, and the shadow in the corner seemed to grow, stretching unnaturally toward me. The whispering grew louder still, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, I heard it. A single, chilling word, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. "Leave." The room seemed to pulse in time with the word, and for a moment, I thought the walls were going to collapse in on me. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay. I had to get out. I reached for the handle again, my fingers numb and shaking. And then, for a moment, just a fleeting moment, the door gave. But the sound that came next was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The door didn't open into the hallway. It opened into darkness. And as I stepped forward, something reached out from the shadows, pulling me back into the room. And I knew then there was no escape. I fought against it, my body thrashing in the darkness. Whatever had pulled me back inside the room was strong, its grasp firm and relentless, like cold fingers wrapping around my chest. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the room, but there was no air, no space to move. The door had closed again. The darkness inside was total. I was trapped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own panic breathing, each inhale sharp and ragged, as if the very air was being drained from my lungs. But then, through the fog of fear, I heard something else, a soft rustling, a movement from the corner where the shadow had been. I turned, but my limbs felt heavy, reluctant to obey. The shadow wasn't there anymore. But something else was. A figure stood in the middle of the room, a faint silhouette against the pitch black. At first, I thought it was just a trick of my eyes, something the darkness had conjured, but then it stepped forward, its movements deliberate and unnaturally slow. It was the same figure from the corner. But this time, it was clearer, more defined, and it was closer, much closer. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in again, pressing tighter with every passing second. I could feel them, the weight of them, as if the very room were alive and breathing with me. The figure took another step, and this time I could see its face. Or rather, what was left of it. Its skin was stretched taut, the features elongated and disfigured. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. But the worst part was its mouth. A jagged grin split its face from ear to ear, the teeth sharp and uneven, glinting in the dim light. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, as if it were frozen in place, locked in a horrible trance. The figure leaned forward, its smile widening, and the air seemed to thicken, becoming dense and suffocating. I could hear its breath, raspy and strained, like the sound of air being pulled through a narrow crack. And then, in a voice that was both distant and close, it whispered, "Stay with me." The words were like a command, pulling at something deep inside me, something I couldn't name. It wasn't just a request, it was a promise. A promise that if I stayed, I would become part of this place. Part of whatever was lurking within these walls. I fought the pull, but it was like being trapped in quicksand. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank into the room, into the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, my vision blurring with each breath I took. The figure stepped closer again, its hand reaching toward me, the long fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that cut straight through my skin, freezing my bones. The touch of it would be death. I was sure of it. It wasn't just a figure, this was something far worse. Something old. Something that had been waiting. Watching. I had to get away. I had to fight. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I pushed myself forward, throwing myself toward the door. I screamed as I slammed my shoulder into the wooden panels, desperate to break free. And then, as though mocking me, the door opened. I gasped in relief, my body moving instinctively toward the light spilling from the hallway. But as my foot stepped over the threshold, I felt a sharp tug, a pull from behind. The darkness reached out, grabbing me with invisible hands, dragging me back into the room. "No!" I shouted, my hands scrabbling against the doorframe. But it was useless. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room was once again swallowed by the oppressive dark. I stumbled backward, now fully understanding the nature of the room. The door wasn't just a barrier, it was part of the trap. It was meant to keep me inside. To keep me here with whatever waited in the shadows. And then I heard it. A laugh. Low and raspy, echoing in the corners of the room. It was the figure. Its grin widened even further, if that was possible, and it stepped closer, the sound of its footsteps growing louder, more insistent. "Stay," it whispered again. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was an order. I tried to scream, to break free, but the room was closing in again, the walls tightening around me. I was caught, trapped in its grip. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that I wasn't alone anymore. The room was not just a place. It was a force. A living, breathing entity that fed off fear, that trapped those who entered within its walls. And now, I was part of it. The darkness swirled around me, and as my vision blurred, I could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if they were calling to me from all sides. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I've been here. Time feels different in this room. It's as if it no longer matters. Sometimes, I hear voices, people outside, maybe, but when I reach for the door, it's always locked. It always closes when I try to escape. I can still feel its presence. The figure is always near, always watching, always waiting. And now, I've begun to hear the whispers in my own voice. Stay with me. I no longer want to leave. I am part of the room now, and the room is part of me. Forever. When I woke, the room had changed. It wasn't the same space I'd entered before. The walls, once dull and unremarkable, now seemed alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. They seemed to breathe in sync with the air around me, and I could feel the weight of them pressing closer. The air was thick, like fog, and my chest tightened with each shallow breath I took. I couldn't remember how much time had passed since I last opened my eyes. Days? Hours? It didn't matter anymore. The concept of time had become irrelevant in this place. I pushed myself up from the floor, my body weak and trembling, but I had to move. I had to find something, anything, to hold on to. But the room didn't give me the chance to rest. The shadows in the corners flickered, twisted into shapes I couldn't fully understand. There were whispers now, more than before. So many voices, overlapping, murmuring to each other in a language I couldn't comprehend. The figure was still there, always in the corner of my vision. It never fully stepped into the light, but I knew it was watching. I could feel its eyes on me, always there, always waiting. Its grin hadn't faded, but I no longer feared it. Or perhaps, I did fear it, but in a way that didn't drive me to escape anymore. It was here to stay. And so was I. I tried to move toward the door again. The handle, the one that had once been my only hope, was still there. But now, when I touched it, there was no sensation at all. It was like the door wasn't even real. My fingers passed through it like it was made of smoke, like it wasn't solid at all. I pulled back, the numbness creeping into my limbs. I looked around for something else. Maybe there was another way out. But all I saw was the room, endless and silent. The walls seemed to stretch infinitely, their features indistinct and shifting. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I had tried every escape, pushing, pulling, shouting. But nothing changed. The door was always just a mirage, just beyond reach, mocking me. And then, the whispering grew louder. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't the soft murmur of my own mind playing tricks on me. The whispers had substance. They filled the room, crawled inside my head, wrapped themselves around my thoughts. They were telling me something. I could hear fragments of words, too distorted to make sense of, but one word, above all, stood out. Stay. I shook my head, trying to block out the voices, but they wouldn't stop. The room had become a prison of sound, a cage for my mind. And with every passing second, the whispers began to feel more like a part of me, like they belonged to me. Stay. It was a chant now, rhythmic, like the pulse of the room itself. I could feel it inside me, urging me forward. It wasn't fear that held me anymore, but something else, something dark, something like acceptance. I didn't want to stay. I didn't. But the longer I fought, the harder it became. The room was changing me. Slowly, subtly. It wasn't the physical space that was shifting, it was me. The figure moved in the corner again, but this time it was closer. I could almost see it in full now, the twisted form that had once been a blur. Its features were still warped, but I could make out something else, something familiar. It looked like me. No, not exactly, but close enough. The same hollow eyes, the same twisted smile. It was a reflection, but not one I recognized. Not one I wanted to recognize. I wanted to scream, to rip my eyes away from it, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my body caught in the same cycle as the room. The whispers seemed to grow in intensity. I could feel my heart rate quicken, my breath shallow, but it didn't matter. The room had claimed me. It was slowly consuming me, and with every second that passed, I became less myself and more like the thing standing in the corner. Stay. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear the walls down, to escape, but the more I fought, the more the room's grip tightened. The floor seemed to move beneath me, the walls pressing closer as if the room itself was hungry. Hungry for me. Hungry for all of us who had entered, seeking something, anything, only to find nothing but the darkness inside. I took a step forward, my legs weak, my mind clouded. The whispers were calling me closer to the figure, urging me to become part of it. The edges of my vision blurred. The air felt heavier. And then, the door appeared. Not like before, this time it was real. It was solid. It was open. I could see it. The light beyond. The way out. But as I reached toward it, I felt the pull. Something deep inside the room, inside me, held me back. My hand hovered over the threshold, but I couldn't make myself step through. I turned away from the door. I stepped into the corner, and the figure reached out to meet me. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was me, and I was it. I don't know how long it's been since I lost track of everything. The whispers are quiet now, but they're still there, lingering in the back of my mind. I am the room now. It doesn't matter who or what I was. The boundaries between the dark space and me have blurred. The walls are part of me, and I am part of them. I no longer need to escape, because I am the darkness, and it is endless. I never invited anyone over, but still, someone showed up. At first, it seemed harmless, even a little odd, but as the days went on, I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. It started one evening when I came home from work. My apartment was quiet, as usual. I lived alone, and the only sounds I ever heard were the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the floorboards as the building settled. But this time, something was different. A small, wrapped package sat on my kitchen table. I stared at it for a moment, unsure. It wasn't there when I left in the morning. No note, no indication of who it was from. Just a small, square box, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin string. I didn't recognize the handwriting on the string, but I didn't feel threatened. It was too insignificant to warrant suspicion. Maybe it was a gift from a neighbor or a mistake. I almost laughed at myself for being so paranoid. I placed the box down, took a deep breath, and began to untie the string. Inside, there was a small stone, smooth and gray. It didn't seem like much, just a rock, but it felt strangely heavy in my hand. There was no card, nothing else. Just the stone. I shook my head, confused. Maybe someone had meant to give it to someone else. I set the stone aside and went about my evening, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't a big deal, I thought. But then it happened again. The next day, when I returned home from work, there was another gift on the table. This time it was a small wooden carving of a bird, intricately detailed, though the craftsmanship was a little off, as if it had been made in haste. I picked it up carefully, inspecting it, and once again, there was no note, no explanation. Just the strange object. A part of me wanted to call the police, but it felt so trivial. A small wooden bird? Who would make a big deal out of something so harmless? But as I stared at it in the dim light of my apartment, a sense of dread began to settle over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone I didn't know, was watching me. And what if the gifts kept coming? What if they escalated? But who was I kidding? I was overthinking this. It was probably some quirky neighbor with a bizarre sense of humor, or maybe an ex who still had my address. I had to let it go. So, I went to bed, trying to shake the feeling. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. The stone from the previous day was gone. I looked around the apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. I checked the table, the counters, even the bathroom, but the stone had vanished without a trace. I stared at the spot where it had been, the memory of its weight still lingering in my palm. Then, a chill ran down my spine. I could have sworn I heard a faint sound, a soft shuffle, like someone was moving around just outside my door. But no one was there. The day went by in a blur. I kept expecting something to happen, kept glancing over my shoulder as though someone was standing just behind me. But nothing did. It wasn't until the following night that I received the third gift. The third gift came late, just as the shadows outside the window grew long. I had come home, exhausted from the day, and the silence of the apartment was almost too much to bear. I dropped my keys on the counter and walked into the kitchen, only to stop dead in my tracks. There it was again. Another package. This one, however, was bigger than the others, almost too big for the table. Wrapped in dark red paper, it had a certain heaviness to it that I couldn't explain. My heart started to race. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The sense of being watched, of being known, hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was inside. But my curiosity got the better of me. I took a breath and slowly, almost mechanically, untied the string, the same kind of thin string as before. The paper fell away, revealing a small, weathered box. It had no markings, no signs of age, but the wood felt different. The texture was rough, as if it had been handled countless times before, worn smooth by unseen hands. I hesitated, but then my fingers found the latch, and with a soft click, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. It was an old photograph, black and white, showing a man and a woman sitting on a bench in what looked like a park. But the image wasn't the strangest part. The strange part was that the man looked familiar. It was as if I knew him, but I couldn't place him. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had never seen this photo before, yet the man's face was one I was sure I had seen somewhere. I turned the photo over, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But there was nothing, just a single, wordless sentence written in the same handwriting as the string that had tied the package together. You're not alone. The blood drained from my face. The words seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating with an unsettling certainty. You're not alone. I dropped the photo, and it fluttered to the floor, face up. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, as my mind raced to make sense of it. I had never seen that man. The woman either. And yet, somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had known them for years. That they had always been there. Watching. A loud crash from the living room broke my thoughts. I rushed to the other room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights outside the window. I checked every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. I stood in the middle of the room, paralyzed. The stillness returned, and it was worse than the noise. The strange feeling of being watched intensified. I thought I could hear someone breathing just behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence of my apartment. And yet, I could feel it. Someone was there. Someone who knew me. Someone who had been here all along. The third gift had changed something. It wasn't just a harmless present anymore. It was a message. A warning. I could feel my heart racing, the cold sweat creeping down my spine. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. But who could I turn to? Who could help me? I had no answers. Only a growing dread that something terrible was coming for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the door, my eyes never leaving the shadows in the corners of the room, the photograph resting beside me on the floor. I kept asking myself the same question: who was leaving me these gifts? The night stretched on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the room with me. The air seemed thicker than usual, oppressive, and I found myself constantly glancing at the door, expecting it to open. My mind was racing, tangled in a web of confusion and fear. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside, seemed to send a shockwave through my already frayed nerves. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. The words written on the back were like a constant hum in my brain: you're not alone. But who was the man in the photo? And why did it feel like I had always known him? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, some weird prank by a neighbor. Maybe it was all just a strange series of events. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just a prank. It was something else. I didn't sleep that night. The minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last. But eventually, when the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, I forced myself to get up. I had to do something, anything. I needed answers. The following day, I made the decision to visit the local police station. I needed to report the strange occurrences. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed something on the kitchen table. Another gift. I felt a lump form in my throat. How was it possible? How had they managed to get in without me hearing? I hadn't heard a sound all night, and yet here it was, sitting on my table, as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the small package. The wrapping was different this time, shiny black paper with an odd, almost oily sheen. I approached it slowly, every step hesitant, my mind racing with possibilities. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know what was happening. With trembling hands, I tore open the package. Inside was a small clock, an old-fashioned brass pocket watch. Its face was cracked, the hands frozen at precisely 3 o'clock. It was cold to the touch, the metal unnaturally smooth. I held it in my hand for a moment, unsure of what to do with it, when I noticed something strange. There was a faint ticking sound, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the watch. I raised it to my ear, and for a moment, I swore I heard something else, like a whisper. But when I looked again, the room was empty. The whisper was gone, and so was the ticking. The watch was silent once more. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. I quickly dropped it back into the box and shoved it to the side, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was coming in short gasps, and I couldn't stop shaking. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to leave. But as I turned to grab my coat, I froze. The door. It was slightly ajar. I never left it open. I was sure of it. I had closed it when I entered, locked it behind me when I left. But now, there it was, cracked open just enough to let a sliver of cold air in. I approached it cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stay away. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I opened the door. There, on the other side, standing at the threshold of the dark hallway, was a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out enough, a silhouette of a person, tall and thin, shrouded in shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But somehow, I knew it was watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and I instinctively stepped back, my hand reaching for the door to close it. But before I could, the figure spoke, its voice barely a whisper in the silence. "You're not alone." The words sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I slammed the door shut, my breath ragged and erratic, my hands trembling. I backed away, my mind reeling, desperate to make sense of what had just happened. But the room was empty. The figure was gone. There was no one outside. Just the same, suffocating silence. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. I was alone, at least, I thought I was. I had no idea who or what was behind all of this, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't safe. I had to get out. But even as I grabbed my coat and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that wherever I went, the shadow would follow me. The night came quickly, and with it, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I had left my apartment, but even as I stepped into the cold night air, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The world outside seemed distant, unfamiliar, as though I were walking through a dream, one I couldn't wake from. I found myself in a small park near my apartment building, trying to clear my mind. The streets were quiet, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic and the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the weight pressing down on me. The cold air stung my face, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, the one who had whispered those haunting words, "You're not alone." But there was nothing. The park was empty, and the silence felt deafening. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my breath visible in the chill. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what? What could I do? I had nowhere to turn. No one would believe me. And then, just as I was about to turn back to the apartment, I heard it. A soft whisper, almost like a breeze, just behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. But when I turned around, no one was there. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. Shaking, I began walking back toward my building, my steps quickening with every passing second. But as I reached the entrance, something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the lobby, was another gift. The same black paper. The same oppressive silence. I stopped in my tracks, fear gnawing in my stomach. How was this even possible? How was this happening? My hand trembled as I reached for the package, my fingers brushing the cold paper. This time, there was no hesitation. I opened it quickly, too quickly, as if tearing it apart would somehow stop the fear from settling deeper into my bones. Inside was a small wooden box, no larger than the palm of my hand. I opened it, almost afraid of what I would find. But there was nothing. No gift, no object. Only a small piece of paper. I unfolded it with trembling hands, already knowing what it would say. You're still not alone. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. The words seemed to echo in my mind, louder this time, more insistent. Something in me wanted to scream, to run, to never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't leave. Not yet. The lobby door behind me creaked open. I turned quickly, my heart racing. For a moment, all I could see was darkness, just a shadow, like the outline of someone standing in the doorway. I squinted into the dark. But there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway. I backed away, bumping into the wall, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My hand fumbled for my phone. I needed to call someone. Anyone. But the screen was blank. No signal. Nothing. It felt like the whole building had gone dark, even though the lights were still on. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the silence almost unbearable. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. You're not alone. I turned again, but the hallway was empty. No figure. No shadow. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, frozen in fear, the world around me spinning as the whispers grew louder. It was like the walls were closing in, like I was being trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Then, something changed. The whispers stopped. And I could hear something else. A slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps on the floor above me. Someone, or something, was moving through the building. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, something in the hallway caught my eye. A figure, just out of view, standing at the edge of the shadows. A tall shape, shifting in the dim light, watching me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The figure was tall, too tall for anyone I knew. It was thin, unnaturally so, and I could see its shape, its outline, but not its face. It was waiting. The air in the lobby grew colder, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not ever. I turned and fled, running out into the street, not caring where I went, just needing to escape. But as I ran, I could feel it, feel the eyes on me, the presence that had been lurking in the dark. It wasn't over. I was never going to be alone again. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in that building, in that place where the air was thick with shadows and whispers. I darted through empty streets, past the flickering streetlights, my mind a blur of panic. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched, hunted, gnawed at me with every step. The whispers in my ears wouldn't stop. You're not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like my throat had been sealed shut, like the world had muted around me. The darkness pressed in, and every shadow, every corner, seemed to hold the figure, waiting for the right moment to appear. But when I reached the edge of the city, the streets began to thin. The buildings became fewer, the lights dimmer, and the cold began to gnaw at my skin. I didn't feel safe here either. If anything, the silence was worse. It was deeper, more suffocating. I found myself at an old bus stop, the bench weathered and cracked. There was no bus in sight, no one around. I collapsed onto the bench, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding. That's when I felt it again. A shift in the air. A presence. I stood up, my mind racing. It was too quiet now. The sounds of the city were gone, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. But then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the ground. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. There, on the bench next to mine, was a small package. I stared at it, my hands trembling. It was different this time. It was wrapped in dark green paper, almost like a funeral wreath, and the string was thick, tightly wound. It looked almost final. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I stood there, frozen, staring at it as though it might explode or open on its own. The whispers grew louder in my mind, a chorus of voices that I couldn't ignore. You're not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to open it. With shaking hands, I tore off the paper, the string falling to the ground like some twisted relic of a forgotten ritual. Inside, there was a small, black velvet pouch. I pulled it open slowly, my fingers moving with an instinct I didn't understand. Inside the pouch was a key. It wasn't just any key, though. It was old, heavy in my hand. It had intricate engravings on its surface, strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them too long. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I held it, like the very metal of the key was alive, thrumming with energy. And then it hit me. The building. The apartment. The place I thought I had escaped. The key was for that place. But I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to know what waited for me there. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind. But the weight of the key in my hand felt like a command, like it was pulling me back. The whispers in my mind were growing frantic now, louder, as though urging me to follow the path they had laid out for me. You're not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. I stood there, paralyzed, the key pressing against my palm like a piece of my own fate. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me. But the whispers didn't stop. The feeling of eyes on me didn't stop. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. It was far off, at the end of the street, but it was unmistakable. The same tall, thin figure. Its outline was barely visible in the moonlight, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The key in my hand seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as my heart. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. The whispers stopped. The world fell silent. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I had finally escaped. But the silence was the worst part. Because deep down, I knew I was never going to escape. Not really. With trembling hands, I pocketed the key and turned back toward the city. I didn't know what awaited me at the apartment. I didn't know what had been watching me all this time. But I knew one thing for certain. It was always going to be with me. I wasn't alone. And I never would be again. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.